What would you do if the person you loved for 4 decades suddenly stripped you of your dignity and your home? This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's a masterclass in legal retribution. A forgotten, rusty key was the only thing standing between a husband's lies and a wife's ultimate justice. For 4 decades, the Henderson residence at 214 Maple Crest Drive was not just a house, it was a living exhibit in the Museum of the American Dream. The narrative was picture perfect, curated with meticulous care. Arthur Henderson, a civil engineer with a firm handshake and a reputation for bedrock integrity at the Hartford firm of Dalton and Pierce. Martha Henderson, the gracious, volunteer-hearted archivist of their shared life, managing not a household, but a universe from their updated colonial in a sterling suburban school district. Their marriage was a tableau of steady, predictable comfort, a silent film of contentment where every scene was familiar and warm. The scent of Saturday morning pancakes was the smell of security. The ritual of hosting Thanksgiving for his colleagues and her book club was a performance of unity. Their calendar was a tapestry of PTA meetings, college savings plans, and brochures for a retirement spent hiking the serene trails of national parks. This was the life they had built, beam by beam, sacrifice by sacrifice. It was not just a marriage, it was an institution, and Martha was its faithful custodian, which is why the filing for divorce arrived not as a document, but as a cosmological event. It was a piece of certified mail from another, colder universe, puncturing the atmosphere of her own. The paper was crisp, the language a sterile, legalistic venom. Irreconcilable differences. The phrase was a hollow, bureaucratic echo in the cathedral of their shared history. It mocked the thousands of quiet reconciliations that constitute a long marriage, the forgiven tardiness, the navigated grief, the silent compromises over thermostat settings and parental philosophy. This was not a crack in the foundation she knew. This was the sudden, total collapse of the ground beneath her feet. The blindsiding was so complete, it felt less like a betrayal and more like a fundamental rewriting of physics. The man she had shared a bed, a name, and a life with for 40 years had quietly stepped out of the portrait, leaving only her, bewildered and alone, staring at the empty space. The first tangible tremor in this new, frightening reality manifested at the local Bank of America branch, a place that had always symbolized prudent tomorrows. Janet, the teller with the kind eyes and the world's best grandma mug, had processed their deposits for 20 years. She'd congratulated them on their children's graduation, asked after Arthur's back. Today, her smile faltered, then vanished as her eyes darted across the screen. Her fingers, usually a fluent blur on the keyboard, hesitated. "Martha, let me print the statements for you," she said, her voice a careful monotone. The printer whirred, spitting out that thin, impersonal paper that held the autopsy report of their financial life. The joint savings account, once a robust reservoir for college tuition, now held a balance that wouldn't cover a semester's textbook. The money market account, their Sunbelt retirement dream, was a ghost of itself. The numbers were a silent scream. And then, the pattern, a 5-year trail of meticulous hemorrhage. Like clockwork, within days of their combined Social Security and pension deposits landing, a transfer would bleed out, $5,000 here, $7,500 there, to alphanumeric account codes that meant nothing to her. JTF Holding, Apex Legacy Trust. This wasn't an emergency or a mistake. This was a scheduled extraction. And in that sterile bank air, thick with the smell of anxiety and disinfectant, the memories of their shared sacrifices curdled. Every frugal choice transformed from a brick in their common fortress into a dollar in his secret war chest. Her decision to pause her teaching career to raise their children wasn't a partnership move. It was a reduction in household oversight. Those summers at Lake George, charming but modest, while his colleagues flaunted European photos. They weren't a mutual choice for financial prudence, but a diversion of fun. Her careful clipping of coupons, her pride in stretching a grocery budget, the worn-out sedan she drove for 12 years. These weren't the humble threads of a shared tapestry. They were the deliberate, calculated funding mechanism for a secret, secondary financial life he had been living parallel to theirs. The man who had eaten her Saturday pancakes had been feeding a separate existence, and she had, with her own labor and love, unknowingly provided the sustenance. The American dream hadn't faded. It had been a facade, a beautiful set piece, and he had been quietly dismantling it from the inside, board by board, for years, leaving her standing in what she only now realized was just empty space and blinding brutal light. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not come as a tear-stained letter or a drunken confession. It arrived in a sterile conference room in Boston, in a 3-inch thick binder from a forensic accountant named Leo. Martha's attorney, a sharp and unsentimental family law specialist named Evelyn Reed, had summoned him. "We need to follow the blood," Evelyn had said, and Leo was a bloodhound for digits. The map he drew on a whiteboard was not just a financial record, it was a masterclass in a modern, premeditated betrayal. Arthur hadn't merely withdrawn money in a panic. He had engineered a digital labyrinth, a Rube Goldberg machine of deceit designed to make marital assets vanish into the ether. The transfers from their joint accounts were just the first clumsy layer. Leo's pointer tapped the board. "See? It goes from your Bank of America joint account to a business checking account for Heritage Bridge Capital, LLC, registered in Delaware, of course." His pointer moved. But Heritage Bridge doesn't do anything. It exists to pay management fees and consulting retainers to another entity, Apex Foundry Group, Inc., a Nevada corporation, Nevada to Delaware. The pointer moved again, across an ocean. Apex then makes quarterly distributions to a fiduciary account at Sterling Trust Limited, Grand Cayman, a shell game played not with walnut shells on a street corner, but with corporate registries and international wire transfers across time zones. Each layer was a door clicking shut, designed to be impenetrable, to exhaust and bankrupt anyone trying to follow. This was not the crime of passion she had vaguely imagined. This was a cold, years-long systems engineering project, and she had been the unsuspecting resource being mined. If Leo's report was the blueprint, the private investigator's dossier was the brutal, full-color construction photos. The investigator, a retired NYPD detective named Frank, with a voice like gravel and a weariness that spoke of seen it all, put flesh on the digital bone. His report was a curated gallery of her husband's new life. There were time-stamped photos of a sleek, glass-walled condo in Miami's Brickell neighborhood, its balcony overlooking azure water dotted with yachts. Receipts, so many receipts, for dinners at Carbone, where the pasta cost more than her weekly grocery bill, and for first-class tickets to Napa Valley. And then, the centerpiece, a series of images taken on a sunny marina walkway. There was Arthur, looking a decade younger, tanned and relaxed, in a Patagonia vest she'd never seen, his smile easy and unburdened. His arm was wrapped around a woman, Chloe, according to Frank's. Chloe, who looked like she'd stepped out of a Peloton, all luminous skin, high-tech athleisure, and artfully messy blonde hair. In one photo, they were leaning into each other, laughing at a phone screen. The intimacy of the gesture was a physical blow. Frank's notes were clinical. Subject and companion appear cohabitational. Vehicle registered to companion. 2023 Mercedes GLC. Fuel purchases align with travel to subject's Miami property. The man who had complained about the cost of heating their Colonial was filling a Mercedes with premium, unleaded for a woman half his age. The shared sacrifices of Lake George had been converted into marina views and designer vests. The life he had built with her was the cost-cutting measure. This was the profit-taking. Arthur's arrogance, now fully informed by his perceived invincibility, crystallized in his first formal settlement offer. It arrived not from him, but from his high-priced Manhattan matrimonial lawyer, on letterhead that smelled of intimidation. The terms were so strategically cruel they took Evelyn's breath away. A one-time, lump sum payment of $150,000. Spousal support set at a bare minimum, structured to sunset in 5 years. The offer was a meticulously crafted weapon, leveraging every assumption he had ever made about her. It was calculated to pressure a frightened, supposedly financially naive homemaker from the suburbs, a woman staring at zeros in her bank account, into grabbing a pittance just to have something, anything, to hold on to. It was designed to make a prolonged legal fight seem like a terrifying gamble against a stacked deck. In his mind, fortified by lawyers and hidden accounts, he had not simply moved on. He had successfully executed a hostile takeover. He had converted their 4-decade-long partnership, the sweat equity of her life, the capital of her trust, the shared history of their family, into a liquid, offshore asset. He had sold off the American dream, and used the proceeds to fund a sleek, sun-drenched sequel, casting her not as the co-author of his life story, but as a minor creditor to be settled with and forgotten. He was offering her a severance package for a job she never knew she was being fired from, while he vacationed on the Golden Parachute. The message was clear. The past was a business that had been dissolved. He was the sole surviving shareholder, and he believed the books were permanently, legally, and irrevocably closed in his favor. All that remained was for the sentimental debris of his old life to accept its scrap and fade quietly away. The Colonial on Maple Crest was no longer hers. The Miami condo was a glimmering prison of his new life. With her finances in free fall and the legal war looking impossibly costly, Martha was forced to liquidate her last independent asset, the classic gray-shingled Cape Cod on 3 wooded acres in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. This was not the house she had built a family in. This was the house she had come from. It was the vessel of her childhood, where her parents had lived and died, a time capsule of a life predating Arthur Henderson. Selling it felt less like a transaction and more like an amputation. Packing it up was an archaeological dig, a slow-motion autopsy of the self she had been before she became a wife. The air in the attic was a specific kind of New England past, dry, still, and thick with the scent of aged pine boards, cedar blocks, and memory. Shafts of afternoon light, heavy with dust motes, cut through the single dormer window, illuminating islands of history. Here were her father's old woodworking tools, each handle polished smooth by his grip, smelling faintly of linseed oil and effort. There was her mother's hope chest, its interior still holding the ghostly perfume of lavender sachets. It was a space of quiet industry and tangible craft, a stark contrast to the digital phantom that had stolen her present. In a corner, under a draped canvas tarp, her hand brushed against cold metal. It was a dented, olive-green lockbox, the kind a cautious man from the greatest generation would trust more than any bank. The combination was her birthday. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were her father's World War II medals, their ribbons still crisp. Beneath them, something unexpected, a small, royal blue velvet ring box. Her heart, so recently a stone of grief, gave a foolish, reflexive flutter. For a dizzying second, in the silent attic, she was a girl again, imagining a secret romantic gesture preserved across decades. She lifted the lid. There was no diamond, no golden band. Nestled in the small, cream-colored satin cavity was a single, heavy iron key. It was crude and substantial, nearly black with age and a fine crust of rust. Its bow was not a simple loop, but cast into an ornate, scrolling letter F. She lifted it. It sat in her palm with a sober, physical weight. No jewelry, no love note. Just this cold, utilitarian object. Puzzlement replaced the fleeting nostalgia. What door did this open? What had her frugal, practical father needed to lock away so permanently? The answer, she knew, would not be on a cloud server or a password-protected spreadsheet. For Charles Wainwright, the world was recorded in ink and paper, in the physical evidence of work and worth. She descended the narrow stairs and went to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in his old study. There, between volumes on local geology and bird identification, stood a line of identical cloth-bound ledgers, their spines labeled by year. She pulled 1987, the year she and Arthur had married. The pages were a masterpiece of meticulous penmanship, columns of figures recording the lifeblood of his small building contracting business. Douglas Fir Lumber, 2x4, Plymouth County permit payment received, Thompson job. And then, on a page near the back, an entry that made her breath catch. Between replace stolen tool voucher and charity Rotary Club, in his unmistakable tight shorthand, it read, October 22nd, F&T Safe Deposit Box, number 247, for my Maggie Bear. Insurance. The letters seemed to pulse. F&T, the Farmers and Trust Bank. A memory surfaced, slow and grainy. A small, granite-faced building with 2 classical pillars in Lennoxdale, a village over. A local institution where everyone knew your name. It had been bought out by Bay State Financial in the late 90s, its identity absorbed, its old vault probably sealed for a generation. Maggie Bear. His nickname for her, unused since his death. Insurance, not against fire, she realized now with a jolt. Against uncertainty, against the unforeseen. Sitting on the bare attic floorboards, the ledger open in her lap, and the cold iron key pressed into her palm, Martha was surrounded by the ghost of her own, more resilient lineage. This was not the curated, performative dream of Maple Crest Drive. This was the quiet, hardened pragmatism of the Depression-era child her father had been, who believed in locks, in deeds, in tangible things that could not vanish with a keystroke. He had, in his way, seen around the corner of time, in her moment of total loss, as the digital world had proven itself a hall of mirrors designed to deceive. This rusty piece of metal became something monumental. It was a lifeline thrown across 36 years. It was a direct wire from his prudent, protective heart to her own shattered one. The despair did not lift, but it parted just for a moment, revealing a narrow path forward. This key was no longer a forgotten relic. It was a question, and in the silent attic of her past, the only question that mattered was the one that carried a flicker of defiant, stubborn hope. The village of Lennoxdale hadn't so much changed as it had faded, like a well-loved photograph left in a sunlit window. The old Farmers and Trust building still stood on the corner, its 2 pillars of local granite looking stubbornly dignified, though the gilt lettering on the window now read, Bay State Financial. Martha pushed through the heavy glass door, the iron key a burning weight in her coat pocket. The interior was all modern bank, bright LED lights, synthetic carpet, the soft whir of a financial printer. It felt antiseptic, alien. But the manager, a man in his 60s named Mr. Henderson, no relation, he assured her with a sad smile, remembered her father. Charlie Wainwright, he said, his voice softening. One of the most honest men who ever walked these floors. He had that box for, must be 50. We never purged the old vault. It's a landmark. His solemn helpfulness was a quiet kindness in a world that had recently offered none. He led her past the gleaming new safety deposit room to a plain, unmarked door marked archival storage. A different key, a modern one, turned in the lock. The staircase down was narrow, the concrete steps worn in the center. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying a scent utterly foreign to the digital world above. Cold stone, aged metal, and the faint, sweet dust of decaying paper. They descended into the bedrock of an older, more substantial America. At the bottom stood the original vault door. It was a masterpiece of pre-war certainty, a monumental wheel of brushed steel set into a frame of foot-thick local granite. It looked less like a bank fixture and more like the entrance to a fortress or a tomb. Mr. Henderson worked the combination, then leaned his shoulder into the wheel. With a deep, metallic clunk that vibrated in Martha's chest, the colossal mechanism released, and the door swung open on hinges as thick as her wrist. The vault chamber was a cathedral of silence. The air was still and profoundly cold. Shelves of dark-stained wood, reaching from floor to ceiling, held long, numbered metal rectangles. The old-style boxes, far larger than their modern counterparts. Their light was a single, caged bulb, casting long, dramatic shadows. It smelled of secrets kept, of values preserved in physical form. Mr. Henderson consulted a faded ledger, then led her to the very back corner. 247, he said quietly, pointing to a long, narrow box on a lower shelf. It was coated in a fine gray dust. He inserted the bank's guard key, turned it, then nodded to her. Your turn. Martha's hands were trembling. She fumbled the iron key from her pocket. It felt alive now, an ancient artifact demanding its purpose. She slid it into the second lock. It fit with a snug, perfect precision that sent a jolt through her. She turned. The mechanism resisted for a heart-stopping second, rust binding decades of stillness. Then, with a gritty, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet chamber, it yielded. Mr. Henderson withdrew the bank's key, gave her a respectful nod, and retreated to the vault entrance, granting her privacy in this profound moment. Alone, she pulled the long, heavy box from its shelf and carried it to a worn wooden table in the center of the room. The moment felt cinematic, yet it was utterly, painfully real. This was the threshold. With a breath she didn't realize she was holding, she lifted the lid. The contents were a time capsule of sober, meticulous foresight. There was no flash of gold, no stacks of cash. On top lay a neat, paper-clipped sheaf of 30 U.S. savings bond, Series E. Their patriotic borders faded, purchased methodically throughout the 1980s. They were fully matured, a quiet nest egg of patient faith in country and future. Beneath them, the documents grew more significant. There, crisply filed in a manila folder, was the original warranty deed and title insurance policy from Berkshire County, dated 1989. The described parcel, 3 acres of commercially zoned land on Route 7, just south of Stockbridge, a plot she knew intimately. It was the land upon which Arthur, flush with his first major contracts, had built the flagship Henderson Engineering Center, the glass and steel monument to his self-made success that was featured in industry magazines. But the deed was in her father's name, Charles Wainwright. Paperclipped to it was a promissory note. Its language was formal, legalese, but its meaning was thunderously clear. It documented a loan of $250,000 from Charles Wainwright to Arthur J. Henderson for the express purpose of land acquisition and initial construction financing. The collateral listed was the Henderson family land, the very plot the deed described. The repayment terms were generous, almost fatherly, but it was unequivocally a loan, a debt. The seed capital for Arthur's empire was not a gift from his brilliance or a gamble of their joint saving. It was a loan from her father, secured by the very earth under his proudest building. The self-made narrative, the foundation of his arrogance, was a myth. He had not built on barren ground. He had built on her family's faith, literally. Then, at the very bottom of the box, her fingers touched the final, decisive layer, a stack of letters, folded neatly and bound with a brittle rubber band. The stationery was familiar. The old letterhead of Henderson and Associate, Arthur's first struggling engineering firm. The handwriting was his, the frantic, slanting script of a younger man, penned in an era of panic before the digital delete key. She unfolded the first. The date was March 1991. Dear Charlie, I am writing to you in a state of utter desperation. The review of the I-91 overpass project has uncovered discrepancy. I may have engaged in some invoice padding to cover cost overrun. There were also gratuities to a county inspector to expedite permits. This is not who I am, but if this comes to light, it is career-ending disgrace. Martha cannot know. I beg you, as a father, for your help. A loan to cover the discrepancy and legal counsel. I am at your mercy. The letters continued. A chronicle of escalating fear and moral compromise. A second from 1992 detailed pressure from a silent partner to manipulate soil test results. A third confessed to using subgrade materials on a public library annex. Each letter was a confession, a plea for a bailout, a promise of reform, and each was meticulously answered, not with a return letter, but with the financial lifeline documented in the promissory note. Her father, the Depression-era pragmatist, had done more than save Arthur's future. He had, with a quiet Yankee shrewdness that understood human frailty and the permanence of ink, archived the original sin. He had preserved the truth in this granite vault, not as a weapon, but as insurance. Insurance against exactly this moment, when the beneficiary of his grace would betray his daughter and try to rewrite. Sitting in the cold vault light, Martha finally saw the complete, devastating picture. Arthur's entire empire, the source of the wealth now hidden in Caymanian shells and Miami condos, was not just legally vulnerable because of a forgotten loan. It was morally rotten at its core. It was built on a triple foundation: her family's capital, her father's silent mercy, and Arthur's own fraudulent choices. The sophisticated digital shell game was just the latest layer of deception, built atop this original, paper-bound bedrock of deceit. The man who had offered her a pittance from his hard-earned fortune had never earned it. He had borrowed it, misused it, and then tried to steal it outright. In her hand, she no longer held just bonds and deeds and damning letters. She held the master key to a vault of accountability he never knew existed. The past, sealed in granite and iron, had just spoken, and it had given her back her voice. The final confrontation did not happen in a packed, dramatic courtroom. It occurred in a bland, windowless conference room adjacent to the Hartford County Superior Court, under the fluorescent glare that made everyone look slightly ill. The air smelled of stale coffee and anxious sweat. Arthur sat flanked by his 2 high-priced Manhattan attorneys, a wall of expensive suits and polished dismissiveness. Martha, with Evelyn Reed at her side, felt the cold weight of the iron key in her purse, a talisman against the paralysis of fear. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for cutting through obfuscation, listened as Arthur's lead counsel began weaving a tapestry of legal fiction. He spoke of non-marital, separate property assets, accrued through post-separation enterprise, of the wife's voluntary disinterest in financial affairs, constituting implicit consent, and of unfounded allegations of dissipation. It was a performance of impenetrable jargon designed to overwhelm and intimidate, to paint Martha as a nostalgic relic clinging to an outdated claim on a modern fortune. Arthur avoided her gaze, studying his hands with an air of weary patience, the wronged captain of industry besieged by a sentimental past. Evelyn Reed waited. She let the grand edifice of their argument be fully constructed in the silent room. Then, with the calm of a surgeon picking up a scalpel, she stood. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, the petitioner's entire case rests on two premises. First, that the marital estate's primary appreciating asset, the Henderson engineering entity and its properties, is the fruit of the respondent's sole post-marital genius. Second, that the respondent is a man of sound professional character whose financial dealings, however complex, are lawful. We would like to enter a single exhibit into evidence that fundamentally disproves both premises." She nodded to a paralegal who brought forward an archival block. From it, Evelyn carefully extracted and entered into the record the matured savings bond, the 1989 warranty deed, and title in Charles Wainwright's name, the promissory note for $250,000 from Arthur Henderson to Charles Wainwright, secured by the Route 7 land. The courtroom clerk made quiet, clicking sounds as each document was cataloged. Arthur's lawyers leaned in, their brows furrowed at this tangible, paper-based anomaly in their digital era case. Then, Evelyn lifted the final item, the stack of letters, still bound in their faded band. "And finally, Your Honor, correspondence between the respondent and the petitioner's father, Charles Wainwright, dated between 1991 and 1993. She read the first line of the March 1991 letter aloud, her clear voice devoid of theatrics. "Dear Charlie, I am writing to you in a state of utter desperation. The review of the I-91 overpass project has uncovered discrepancies. I may have engaged in some invoice padding to cover cost overruns." The color drained from Arthur's face completely, leaving a waxy, ashen mask. It was not the flush of anger, but the pallor of a man whose hidden crypt has just been flooded with light. His eyes, wide with a kind of horrified recognition, locked onto the familiar stationery. His own frantic handwriting, a ghost from a past he believed he had buried forever. One of his attorneys placed a restraining hand on his arm, a silent command to remain still. The other lawyer began to sputter an objection about relevance, about statute of limitation. The judge silenced him with a raised hand, her eyes fixed on the document. The legal dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. This was no longer a divorce hearing about asset division. It was a forensic audit of a man's moral and professional foundation. The sophisticated shell game of LLCs and offshore accounts was revealed for what it was, a frantic, modern superstructure built atop a rotting, fraudulent core. The negotiation that followed was not a negotiation at all. It was a surrender. Faced with the imminent prospect of Evelyn notifying the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the State Contractors Board with this evidence, crimes past the statute for prison, but eternally potent for professional ruin, massive civil fines, and tax reassessment, Arthur's facade crumbled. His lawyers, their bluster gone, switched to damage control. The settlement agreement that was drafted in the following days was a near total inversion of his first insulting offer. The Miami Brickell condo, its mortgage paid with marital funds, was transferred to Martha. The digital labyrinth of Heritage Bridge Capital and Apex Foundry was unwound, its assets deemed marital property and awarded to her. The majority ownership interest in Henderson Engineering Center, the building on her father's land, was signed over, making her the controlling partner in the business built with her family's capital. The investment portfolios, the hidden accounts, all were traced and restored. Arthur was left with his substantial personal debt, a drastically reduced minority stake in his own firm, and the crushing weight of a professional reputation that was now irrevocably smoke and ash. The story inevitably leaked. The Hartford Courant business desk, piecing together court filings and whispers from the tight-knit New England engineering community, ran a feature that spared no detail. The headline read, "A Connecticut Legacy Unraveled: How a Rusty Key Unlocked a 40-Year Deceit." It chronicled the self-made man exposed, the family capital concealed, the fraud confessed. In a world built on trust and reputation, Arthur Henderson became a ghost at his own banquet, a man professionally and socially erased. Martha, her financial dignity not just restored but secured for generations, did not retreat to a life of quiet luxury. With the first dividends from the engineering firm, she established the Maggie Bear Grant at the Stockbridge Women's Resource Center, a fund dedicated to legal and financial advocacy for women navigating the complex terror of economic abuse. She ensured others would have the weapons she had almost lacked. In the end, justice was not a loud, gavel-pounding verdict. It was not a dramatic scream of vindication. It was a series of silent, irrevocable action, the smooth turn of a rusted key in a forgotten lock, the soft click of a safety deposit box opening, the decisive scratch of a pen transferring a stolen dream back to its rightful owner. It was the sound of a balance, perverted for decades, being finally and permanently set right. The American dream he had meticulously stolen, the dream of security, legacy, and honest reward, was returned, not just as it was, but with a full, compounding interest of truth, justice, and a father's love. The facade was gone. What remained was solid, earned, and finally, wholly hers. A personal story of betrayal into a powerful educational framework for financial and legal empowerment. The key takeaway is the indispensable value of tangible evidence and old-fashioned record-keeping in our digital age. While Arthur constructed a labyrinth of digital shells, his entire scheme unraveled because of physical, paper-based proof, a deed, a promissory note, handwritten letters preserved in a granite vault. This underscores a critical lesson for everyone. Vital documents proving ownership, loans, or agreements must be kept in a secure, accessible, and physical form. Digital records can be altered or hidden with a keystroke, but a piece of paper with a signature or a rusted key to a safety deposit box can become an unassailable anchor for truth. Furthermore, the story illuminates complex but crucial legal and financial concepts in an accessible way. It demonstrates forensic asset tracing, showing how wealth can be followed back to its true marital source, defeating attempts to hide it. It reveals how past misconduct, even if beyond criminal statutes, can destroy credibility in civil proceedings under the unclean hand doctrine. Strategically, it highlights the power of leveraging collateral consequence, the threat of exposing fraud to tax authorities or professional boards to force a settlement, a reality often more decisive than a trial verdict. Most importantly, the arc from victimhood to advocacy provides a blueprint for navigating and recovering from financial abuse, a form of control that isolates victims through secrecy and complexity. Martha's final act of creating the Maggie Bear Grant completes the educational journey, modeling how restored security can fuel systemic support for others. Ultimately, this is a story about leveling an uneven playing field. It teaches that against sophisticated deceit, the most potent weapons are often a combination of diligent preparation, understanding the rules of the game, and the courageous persistence to follow a thread of truth, no matter how faint, to its source.